By controlling your weeds early in the winter or early in their life cycle, you are eliminating the competition for your planted species and allowing your red clover and your crimson clover, in the example I'm using, to fill in that vacant growing space and head into spring green up at a better starting point than they would if you waited for a month to control that competition. If you control those weeds in January, and your crimson clover and red clover, they're going to be kind of growing slowly in January and February because it's really cold and not a great growing conditions, but they will slowly fill in that vacant growing space, and they'll have a good root system and they'll be excellent coverage. So they head into spring green up sitting on G and waiting on O. They are ready to take off as soon as the weather is cooperative.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Jacob Dykes.
And I'm Eric Mitchell, and we're the co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab.
As hunters, deer biologists, and wildlife professors, we're passionate about bridging the gap between research and management.
Each episode, we explore the latest deer research from around the country, breaking it down to discuss how it can improve wildlife and habitat management on your land.
Whether you're a hunter, a land steward, or simply interested in deer biology, Deer University is for you. Let's switch gears to seed mixes. I feel like this is one of those things that everybody's got a question about. You know, what can I put in my food plot that's going to be, it's going to complement whatever else I'm planting, but also it's going to give me what I'm looking for. And a couple of ways that I start this conversation is, one, you're looking for, biomass. You're looking for production. And there are some plants that don't complement each other, some that will actually hinder each other. You're looking for forage quality, you're looking for deer preference. That's kind of the considerations when you're talking seed mixes. And then my priority is maturation dates. I want to prolong that food plot as long as I possibly can. So if I can plant it and still have something to turkey hunt over in the spring, that's what I'm looking for. So Luke, what do you think about seed mixes?
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, and that is right where my head goes too. You said, what word you said? You said complement. The word used was complement when you are coming up with seed mixes. And when I'm thinking about mixing various species in a food plot, whether it's warm season or cool season, it is all about complementing and not competing. So, for example, a really good complementary food plot planting in the cool season, in my opinion and based on my experience, is going to be something like crimson clover and wheat. Okay, you have different species, obviously, and they're in different groups. You got a grass and you've got a legume, but their growth form, the timing that they are reproducing relative to being in a vegetative state, the way that deer select them, I mean, they're all very similar with those two species in the areas they should be similar. So they're not really competing with each other that much, right? But if you plant crimson clover and turnips, or crimson clover and some other type of brassica, those brassicas germinate really quickly and very fast. They put on a big leafy, canopy. And brassicas, everyone's got a different perspective on this, and I know people have found ways to make seed mixes that have a high percentage of brassicas work with other species. But my preference is, if I'm going to plant a brassica food plot, it is just going to be a brassica food plot. Maybe there's some cereal grains in there, but I'm not putting certainly not a heavy rate, if any, clovers in there, because those brassicas leaf out and they get over top of almost everything else, maybe with the exception of some cereal grains, and they outcompete a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's the same idea we talk about with forest stand improvement of not getting sunlight to the ground. It's kind of the same idea with the brassicas. They got the big canopy, and then everything that's around them right there just doesn't get the sunlight that it needs to be as productive as it could, at least. Very simple explanation there.
Yeah. So, and then maturation date, I'm on the exact same wavelength. And one of my favorite things to do and favorite topics is to think about and implement food plots based on maturation date, and how we can use a single food plot planting to address multiple nutritional bottlenecks throughout the year. Okay. So, like I said, like we all mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the most nutritionally demanding time of year in the Deep South is that mid to late summer. So we generally are going to want, if our focus is managing the nutritional profile on a property with our food plots or supplementing the nutritional profile, we want to make sure that we are hitting that mid to late summer stress period with our food plots. Oftentimes, we're immediately going to go to a warm season food plot for that, planting soybeans or cowpea or American joint vetch or whatever. But you can plant a cool season food plot and address that same thing with annuals. I mean, a lot of times people would think of, planting a perennial clover plot or alfalfa because they will be actively growing some in the mid to late summer. They're kind of starting to peter out by then. But let's say if you plant this is just one example. There's lots of ways to do this, but if we're planting a fall food plot in September, October, and we're going to include wheat, crimson clover, and red clover, that wheat and crimson clover they're both annuals, and they are going to produce excellent biomass in the fall and winter to hunt over. And you're still going to be able to turkey hunt over that crimson some. And the wheat seed heads, especially if you use awnless wheat, are highly attractive to deer once they mature. And turkeys will get in there and wear out those wheat seed heads if it's awnless wheat while they're still on the plant. And if it's not awnless wheat, once those seed heads hit the ground, turkeys will wear them out. So you can hunt over just the crimson and the wheat, both in deer season and in turkey season. If you also include red clover in the mix, by the time crimson and wheat are petering out, in that kind of March, April, May timeframe, that red clover is starting to come on, and it will be producing tremendous biomass June, July. And if you get rainfall and if you manage your weed competition appropriately, I've got red clover in food plots that was planted last fall that is still producing, and it is August 25th.
Yeah.
So by, just carefully selecting a few species, you can essentially have a 12-month food plot that was planted one time. And it's not a perennial food plot. I mean, red clover is considered by all the, forage and pasture experts to be a short-lived perennial, but we're not managing it like a perennial. We're managing it as an annual. And by planting those species, you can have a 12-month food plot program and exceptional hunting too.
Yeah. And that's another good point. We talked earlier about herbivores. They're not all created equal. Well, plants aren't either, right? From a nutritional standpoint, from the way that they grow. You talked about complementing. Well, one of the simple Nebraska's was absolutely going to be my example too. But then also, if you think about your cereal grains, your wheat, your oats, things like that, they tend to pop up very quickly, and they're going to provide food to a deer while your clovers are trying to establish. So call it a nursery crop, if you will, whatever you want to call it. But they pop up and protect those young clovers as they're starting to establish. So that's another way that they complement each other. But yeah, you can stagger these forages just because they grow at different times, they mature at different times, and they senesce at different times. If you put the right mix together, I mean, you're absolutely right. You're from what was planted September, October last year, you're still seeing food on the ground as far as red clover goes. And it's fun to watch those mixes. And we plant them side by side often because we're doing research with them, but it's fun to watch them just cut out. They'll flower and they'll be beautiful. And then boom, there's a warm snap, May hits, and one of them will shut down. And then you'll see the next one start to reach its peak. And then boom, it shuts down. So it's really interesting the way that they grow and complement each other.
Yeah. I think that's one of the fun things about food plots, right? Is there's so many different options. It's almost an art. You can just pick and choose and really fine tune it for you and what works best for your property and the situations that you're trying to take advantage of. I mean, we can tell people what we're, talking about all day on this podcast, but until you get out and really start to implement some of these things, you might find that something totally different works best for you and your property, right? And that's what's a lot of fun. So there's flexibility to do it your way.
Well, and I would like for people to take that away is because, again, I get calls at this time of year. I get a call every day or an email every day that's asking, will this grow here? Should I plant this? And it's like, there's no right answer for that, but it's fun to play around with this. See what works on your property. See what the nutritional limitations across a property are not the same. Your neighbor's property is very different than your property. So play around with some of these mixes. There's not a right or wrong answer. There's not if anything, we've got research to show that there is not a magic bullet plant. There is not one that we can sit here and tell you that, hey, that's what you need. But if you plant these mixes, again, we're always talking about diversity in plant community. If you plant these mixes, they've got the options. and you managed your habitat. So they got lots and lots of options to choose whatever it is that they need.
Yeah.
And when we're talking mixes, so we're talking annuals right now. So we're talking cereal grains like oats, wheat, and wheat. I'm glad you mentioned the onless variety, because that's a good point. Just because that it's grown up, it's high in fiber, it's lignified, deer aren't eating it anymore. They will still eat those seed heads. And that onless variety, it's the beardless. A lot of people call it the beardless variety of wheat. It just doesn't have the stiff hairs running up and down the seed head. As you can imagine, it's more palatable, easier to eat when it doesn't have all that. There's a lot of these forages that you get a lot of time out of, a lot of nutrition to address, like you said, Luke, those different nutritionally stressful periods for deer. And then clovers. Luke, how many different clovers you got planted right now, or will be planting in the next, it's already in the end of August. We'll be planting soon. So, how many clovers?
Probably upwards of a dozen different varieties of clover.
Yeah.
We got all sorts of different experiments going on and things we're evaluating. So two points I want to touch on. One, I want to touch on the clovers and different maturation dates, because that's a big part of this. But one of y'all touched on a minute ago on just trying stuff on your property and seeing what works, and the art of food plotting. And this is by far my favorite soapbox to get on with anything habitat management. Sit here on the podcast and publish papers and all this stuff on the research and what the science says on habitat management, but nothing, including the best science in the world, will replace you as the land manager being a steward and a learner of your property and what works on your property. So go experiment. Use what we say as a starting point, like, based on my soil texture and how much moisture I get in sunlight, I think this suite of species would do well, and then go plant them and see what works best, and then do more of what works good and do less of what doesn't work good. Same thing for fire timing and timing of disking, and all sorts of stuff. Every property is going to produce a different response based on the specific conditions on that property. So go experiment. I think that is the most fun and rewarding part of this whole habitat management process, is not just the science of it. The science is there, but the art of it is what's really fun to me.
I'm glad you said that too, because one thing I like to point out is the whole reason we do the podcast and the outreach and all of that stuff is because the number one wildlife and habitat management tool we have are y'all that are out on your properties doing this stuff, whether it's habitat management, where it's food plots. Y'all are the ones that's making a big difference. We just try to answer some questions and then get that, that information out to you. So perfect. I'm glad both of y'all brought that up. Yeah, absolutely. Get out there and play around with this stuff. There's lots of options. There's not a right answer. There are a couple things you should stay away from, but when it comes to cereal grains, there's lots of options there. The clovers, we've crimson red, arrowleaf, balança, berseem. And there's all different varieties of those, and lots of different clovers and stuff too. And yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. So regarding varieties of clovers, and I'll kind of hit this at a 30,000 foot level, and then whatever y'all want to dive into the weeds on, so to speak, just we can go there. So I guess I'll start with maturation timing of most of the clovers that we plant. I'm going to focus on the annuals, and I'll throw red clover into the annual conversation too, even though it's technically a biennial or a perennial. So when let's say we plant a variety of clovers in the fall, annual clovers in the fall, so September, October, and we look at the timing that they peak in production and the timing they mature throughout the following spring. So most clovers, you plant them in the fall, they're going to be producing very good biomass at some point the following spring, and then they're going to mature, produce seed, and they're going to be done for the annuals. So if we kind of start with the earliest maturing clover and work our way forward, we're going to start with crimson. Crimson is going to be the earliest maturing clover, which also means that it's one of the most productive clovers during deer season. So its timing of biomass production is going to, line up the best with deer season. So we start with crimson, and then, 2 to 3 weeks later, balança is going to be coming on. And then very close to the same time as Balanza is going to be Persian. And I'm thinking of some of the new improved varieties of Persian. I'm thinking of Grass and Oregon's got one that's called Enhance Persian. And it's this really large leaf variety of Persian, which is, I really like it. And we've kind of been fooling with it over the years. So Persian and Balanza are going to be very similar. And then 3 to 4 weeks after those are petering out, we're going to have Berseem. And Berseem is kind of going to be that, mid to late May timeframe. And then we've got Airleaf, and Airleaf is going to be late May to early June when it's really doing its thing. And then after Airleaf, we've got Red Clover. And there are other varieties. I'm just going over the main, 6, 7, 8 of them. And Red Clover is going to be peaking in production in June and July if managed appropriately. And if you get the right moisture precipitation throughout the summer. And if you select your site properly, that's another important part of this. If you select your site properly, you will have Red Clover producing into August.
Yeah. And look, we got all the rain this year. We do have Red Clover still producing.
Absolutely.
You sent me pictures a couple of days ago. And one thing I want to throw in there real quick, just because I got it a couple of weeks ago, Red Clover does not have the red flower. It has a pink flower, pinkish flower. Crimson clover is the one that has the red, the maroon. So just anybody that's seen that, you'll typically see it growing on the side of the highway. That is the crimson clover that we're referring to, and is one of my go-to clovers, a really good one. Yep. But look, that's a great point. So you just explained and how all these complement each other. And there's lots of different varieties within each one of those clovers as well. Some tend to be more tolerant of wet conditions, or yes. For example, Frosty Berseem is one of those that might be better up north. It's very, it's resilient to frost and colder temperatures. So there's lots of these different varieties that when you start looking into them, that you can really pick and choose based off what you're interested in.
Yep. So I'll hit on some of the basics here real quick. As far as clovers that tolerate dry conditions very well, and there's lots of exceptions here, but the ones that tolerate dry tend to tolerate well-drained soils very well. I'll put it that way. Relatively dry conditions. That's going to be your crimson and your arrowleaf, and red clover to some extent. Those do very well in drier soils. The ones that do, and I'm talking even standing water for a significant portion of the year, that's going to be your Balanza, your Berseem, and your Persian. And then if we throw our perennials in there, Ladino tends to do better in a little moister, shadier sites. Durana tends to do a little better in higher, drier sites. And then in terms of cold tolerance, there's a lot of data out there to suggest that Frosty Berseem is very good, but the Balanza, the fixation variety of Balanza, supposedly is the most cold tolerant annual clover that exists. So if you're, up in the Midwest or further north, that, Balanza fixation clover is extremely cold tolerant.
Yeah.
And in terms of cereal grains, there's so many variables here, but in terms of cereal grains, generally speaking, your most cold hardy cereal grain is going to be your cereal rye, and then it's going to be wheat, and then it's going to be oats, meaning that oats is the least, and there are varieties of oats that are very cold hardy, but your just generic variety that you go get from the co-op of oats is going to not be as cold hardy or as cold tolerant as cereal rye is. So there's so many different variables we got to keep in mind when we're building seed blends, and where we're planting in terms of the soil or the hydrology of the site, how much water it holds, how much water we think it's going to hold when that clover is really supposed to be producing. That's extremely important. So if it's a really wet site, I'm going to lean more towards a Balanza instead of a crimson. Then latitude, obviously, there's a big factor there where if you're further north, you're going to want to select more cold hardy species. Further south, it doesn't matter as much unless you get one of the years like we've had the last couple where you get this like really severe cold snap in January and it just whacks all of your stuff except the most cold hardy. And then going back to the seed blends conversation, I cannot think of an example or a situation where I would plant, for example, crimson and Balanza with each other because they are maturing and peaking in production within a couple weeks of each other, and sometimes right around the same time. So you're only going to be inhibiting one another by planting them together. Instead, it'd be much better to plant crimson and Berseem because they are going to not overlap as much, and their maturation timing is 4 to 6 weeks different. Likewise, I do not like to plant. Some people love to do this. I can think of a few people that I've seen do this, and they just love to do it. But I do not like to plant arrowleaf with red clover. Arrowleaf is peaking in production at the time when red clover is really starting to take off. And then also think about the growth form of these various plantings. Balanza gets really tall and stemmy. Crimson is more of a shorter growing clover. Arrowleaf is really tall and stemmy, whereas red clover, at least earlier in the growing season, is really short. So if you plant arrowleaf clover with red clover and the deer grazing pressure is not enough to keep that arrowleaf clover down closer to ground level, it is going to get over top of your red clover and completely smother it. And by the time your arrowleaf dies, in late May or June, your red clover it hasn't been devoting resources to growth and a good root system going into the summer. So it's not going to produce as well going to July and August when it's really dry. It'd be much better to plant red clover from my perspective with something like crimson. That way, by the time the crimson dies out in, April, maybe early May, March, April, early May, depending on your latitude, that red clover has all of May and June to put on a good, robust root system. That way, by the time you get into July and August, when it gets really dry, your red clover is set up for success.
Yeah.
Alternatively, you're setting it up for failure if you plant it with something that it's going to be competing with.
Sure. And not to overcomplicate it, but there's so many options out there. There is a way to be strategic with it. And you mentioned growth form. So I think that's an important conversation on the cereal grain side of things too, especially if you're interested in, say, turkey hunting and that kind of thing. Any input on that? Different forages, how tall they grow? And
yeah. So if I want to turkey hunt over that plot, I'm probably not going to put cereal rye in it. And if I do, it's not going to be at a heavy rate at all. Yeah. It might be maybe 5 to 10 pounds per acre. If you plant 50 plus pounds per acre of cereal rye, it's going to be twice as tall as a turkey. And A, they might not want to be in it depending on what else is in there. And B, if they are, you're probably not going to be able to see them. Yeah. So oats and wheat are a much shorter growth form cereal grain. And turkeys are going to tend to be in those plots more than a cereal rye plot. Same thing with clovers. If you've ever seen especially a monoculture stand of Balanza in March or April, it is rank. I mean, I've seen turkeys nest in those plots, but good luck walking through that. I'm talking me walking through it. I can barely get through it, let alone a turkey. I mean, they can get very rank. Same thing with arrowleaf. Whereas crimson, it's a lot, lower growing. It's a lot easier for turkeys to navigate. So if I'm thinking about turkeys, I'm going to go crimson at, 15 or 20 pounds per acre and awnless wheat at, 40, maybe 50 pounds per acre. And that's going to be a jam up plot to hunt in the fall and a turkey hunt in the spring.
Yeah. Yeah. Just some other considerations. And we get the privilege of planting all of these side by side. So it's funny to walk through some of your cereal grains and then you come to like the cereal rye that's chest deep. Mm-hmm. You're like, oh, this is a little different here. So yeah, just some other considerations there. And lots of options. Like you said, save your money. Instead of getting two that are going to compete, pick another one that's going to, make that food plot last a little bit longer. And that's just us talking about the annual options. If we start talking, so we've mentioned warm season, which is not our focus today, but a lot of times what I recommend people to have is have an annual cool season plot, couple plots, whatever it may be, have a separate spot for your warm season forages, just because you can prolong the time of these to the point to where, for example, in October, I have successfully harvested deer over my deer veg. So I don't want to be disking that in September to plant my cool season plots. So you can pick certain areas to, hey, that's my warm season. This is my cool season. And that over there is my perennial plot that I don't want to get back in. I want to do a little bit of management. That's my safety net that I hope every year is going to come back for 4, 5, 6+ years. So what about your perennial plots, Luke?
In terms of what specifically, or just
what's your go-to with perennials? The options are far and fewer.
Yep.
But what's your go-to?
Well, probably my favorite perennial, and some people would call it a biennial, but one of my absolute favorites is going to be red clover. Red clover, when managed as a perennial, not only is it technically a perennial in some cases, meaning, well, I guess let me talk about for a minute the difference between annual, biennial, and perennial. So annuals like crimson clover are going to complete their entire life cycle in 1 year. So they're going to germinate, they're going to grow, they're going to flower, produce seed, and then that individual plant is going to be dead within 12 months. Now, crimson clover is an excellent reseeder, so even if you don't replant it, you will have coming back the following year, but that is not the same plant as was there the previous year. It's seed from that previous crop. So that's an annual. Your biennials, generally speaking, are going to, and again, some exceptions, but generally speaking, they are going to germinate 1 year and put on vegetative growth throughout that first year. And then their second year, they are going to flower and reproduce, and then they'll be dead. Some biennials flower and reproduce the first year and the second year and then die, but a lot of them will just grow for a year, put on vegetative growth, leaf growth, and then the second year they'll flower, reproduce, drop seed, and then be dead. And then you got your perennials like ladino, durana, alfalfa, etc. And those, the same individual plant will, with proper management, can remain in your food plot for 5, 10, or even more years. So those plants are more like, in terms of their longevity, more like a shrub than a crimson clover plant. They are perennials. They are coming back from the same root system year after year after year after year. And many of those perennials are also good reseeders. So when you manage the perennials properly, not only are the individual plants that you planted year 1 hanging on year 2, 3, 4 into year 5, but they're also producing seed that, fills in vacant growing space for whatever reason and helps to kind of propagate that food plot. But it's very important for your perennials to be really on top of the timing of your herbicide applications. I've seen many a perennial food plot that was looking awesome in April, May, and June. And then this is very common with absentee landowners who don't live on the property and aren't visiting their property very often. They might have a perennial clover plot that's looking awesome in May, and then they come back in July and it has been completely overtaken by weeds. And, that's not the end of the world. Oftentimes you can recover those and you might need to topsoil a little bit, but the most productive perennial food plots are the ones where you have eyes on them every couple of weeks and you can, make split decision management decisions with herbicide recommendations and timing of your mowing to top off some of the annual weeds, etc.
And that's a good point, and it can go year to year too. I mean, Eric and Luke, our warm season food plots this year, no issues last year. This year we had a massive flood. We've had more rain than we could ever have in the field, and so we're fighting a battle that we didn't have to fight last year from a weed perspective. And that's kind of the same idea. If you're not laying eyes on it, it can turn into a jungle real quick. And then you bring up an important point there. Based off of these mixes, it limits your ability to fight weeds based off of the different herbicides and stuff that you can choose. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit. But yeah, I really like this conversation on especially what you said about red. It's considered a biennial, but man, it is a massive reseeder. So is Balanza. That stuff's there. It's reseeding each year. It's likely going to come back if you do everything that you should, but lots of different ways to go about that, to replant every year, to facilitate those reseeders, to have the perennials. That's the fun in it. This is probably the funnest part to me, is playing around with this different stuff, the management strategies.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think when you're designing a seed blend, and if you want to use really good reseeders to reduce or eliminate the need to plant the following year, kind of going down in order of from best reseeders down to intermediate or bad reseeders, Balanza is, I would almost classify Balanza as borderline invasive sometimes. That thing is such an aggressive reseeder. I've literally got food plots right now that I know for a fact a Balanza plant has not gone to seed in 4 years because I have sprayed it every single year before it goes to seed, and I still have Balanza coming up every single year from the seed bank. So,
Well, also here,
incredible.
It's so wet too. And Balanza, like you said, that is the one, man, I've seen it grow underwater, it seemed like.
Yeah.
So it's impressive the way that it has come back.
Yep. So Balanza is an excellent reseeder. Crimson is a very good reseeder. Arrowleaf is a very good reseeder. Berseem, when I do see it reseed, it's very sporadic, not as much. And then red clover is I classify red clover as a moderate or an intermediate reseeder. It does pretty good, but because it is a short-lived perennial, I mean, I'm not as worried about it reseeding. If you manage red clover properly, you shouldn't have to replant more than maybe every couple of years.
Yeah. When I think about crimson, and Eric, I'm sure all of us have seen this. If you go down the highway, you see all that. They're not planting crimson every year on the side of the highways. A lot of that is that reseeding nature of crimson. It's beautiful. It's one of my favorite clovers. But yeah, you did a phenomenal job explaining the difference in the annuals and perennials, and the different ways that you could play around and facilitate the reseeding and that kind of stuff. All right. Mixes. We've got lots of publications y'all should check out that talks about the different mixes. And we're talking deer management, but we're also talking of every other critter you could have an interest in, the way that you could feed those as well. Real quick, Luke, why don't you tell us a little bit about Pure Live Seed?
Okay, so let me go back to perennials real quick. I don't feel like I did that quite justice, and I'm going to hit this at a very high level before we move on to PLS. So I'm just going to cover the two most common perennial white clovers here, and this could be an hour-long conversation in and of itself. I'm just going to talk about Durana and Ladino white clover. So Ladino and Durana are probably the two most common perennial white clovers that we're going to see in a food plot context. Durana, they're two varieties of the same species. Okay, so they're the same species, but they've been bred for different traits. Durana has been bred to be very grazing tolerant and to suppress weeds really well. It's also very tolerant to a lot of trampling. So if you're using it in like a pasture, it can tolerate getting trampled a lot by cattle. It's very grazing tolerant, and it suppresses weeds really well. One of the reasons it suppresses weeds really well is it vigorously reproduces by stolons. So stolons are this essentially root of the plant that grows on the surface and spreads out from the original plant, and it spreads essentially along the surface of the ground. So it kind of creates a nice carpet and suppresses weeds via its stolon growth. So Durana has smaller leaves. It doesn't produce as much biomass, but it is more grazing tolerant, and it performs much better. I would say much better in dry, droughty conditions relative to Ladino. Ladino produces more biomass. It produces larger leaves. It's not as grazing tolerant, but it does better in wet conditions. So if we're thinking about managing a perennial food plot, and let's say our objective is to address a nutritional limitation on the landscape, which is in the deep south is going to occur mid to late summer. If my objective is to hit that mid to late summer nutritional stress period and I want to plant a perennial food plot, I'm probably going to lean towards Durana instead of Ladino, because in the years where it's really wet, your Durana is going to hang on longer, deeper into the summer, and continue producing biomass relative to your Ladino. Now, in terms of areas, if I got a wetter area versus a drier area, I'm going to plant Ladino in the wetter area, or maybe the shadier area, and I'm going to plant Durana in the drier or sunnier sites, just because that's where they perform better. Like I said, that is not at all exhaustive on the perennials, but that's just kind of a cursory look at the two most common perennial white clover varieties.
Yeah, I've always really liked, well, both of them, but Durana, it puts a lot of its energy in its root system. That's one reason that it is a little more tolerant of droughty conditions and that kind of thing. And it does tend to grow in more of a thick mat than, say, your Ladino. It's just always been the difference in mine. In my opinion, one tends to put a little more energy into above ground biomass. The other tends to put a little more in the root, makes it a lot more hardy.
Sure.
So yeah, great point. Glad that you added that in. One of the most important parts talking about these mixes, tend to buy all ours at the co-op. We'll go to the co-op, we'll order whatever seed we need. But when we start talking about these mixes and these planting rates and different things like that, one of the things that comes up is the Pure Live Seed, the PLS, and that is important. And I feel like we're still trying to get that information out to people, but what you're buying may not be exactly what you think it is for this reason. Luke or Eric, do y'all want to chime in on PLS? Explain that a little bit.
Yeah,
go ahead, Luke. Yeah.
You want to go ahead or you want me to do it?
You go ahead.
Okay. So Pure Live Seed, I would say, is the most commonly overlooked maybe next to soil amendments, soil tests and soil amendments, it is probably the most commonly overlooked or disregarded parts of establishing a high quality food plot. It is so simple, but it is so fundamental and can absolutely make the difference between a successful food plot and a complete failure. So let's take crimson clover, for example. If you buy a bag of crimson clover, you will oftentimes see, let's say you go to the co-op and buy a bag of crimson clover and you look at the seed tag. Always look at the seed tag on the bag of clover or whatever seed. It could be cereal grain, could be soybean, could be clover. Always look at the seed tag. You will see a bunch of numbers listed on that seed tag, but for the pure live seed portion of this discussion, the two most important numbers are going to be your germination rate, and I'm writing some numbers down here so I can do some math as an example. Your germination rate and your pure seed percentage. So there's going to be dormancy values. There's going to be inert material, and your inert material is just going to be like the chaff or other weed seeds that are in that seed bag. But for calculating pure live seed, you want to know your germination percentage and your pure seed. So on a typical bag of crimson clover from the co-op, your germination is going to be somewhere around 85%. Your pure seed percentage on a typical bag of crimson clover is going to be usually 47-ish%, somewhere around 50%.
Yeah.
Meaning that 47% of the weight, let's say you buy a 50-pound bag, 47% of that 50-pound bag is actually pure seed. So let me get my calculator. If you do 47% of 50, that means only 23.5 pounds of that 50-pound bag is actually crimson clover seed. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you got to factor in not only the pure seed percentage, but also the germination rate. Only 85% of that 23.5 pound bag is actually going to germinate, or the bag is 50 pounds, but there's only 23.5 pounds of actual seed in that bag. So only 85% of that is going to germinate. So multiply that 23.5 number by 0.85, and all of a sudden we end up with 19, essentially 20 pounds of pure live seed in a 50-pound bag. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through that math again, just so, and we've got lots of resources out there. Just look up pure live seed calculation. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to take the your germination percentage. So let's say 85%. So we're going to do 0.85 times our pure seed percentage, which in this case is 0.47. And we're going to take our desired seeding rate. So let's say crimson clover, we want to plant 20 pounds per acre. And we're going to divide our original number, or divide 20 by the germination times pure live seed. That's sounding very confusing. Just look up a formula for it. So 20 divided by that. So in reality, to get 20 pounds per acre of PLS, we would need to plant 50.1 pounds of that crimson clover. So a lot of people, they say, oh, I want a solid stand of crimson clover. I'm just going to go out and plant 20 pounds of seed. You know, a 50-pound bag should give me 2.5 acres worth. Well, if you plant 20 pounds of crimson clover with those parameters I just listed, you're going to have less than a 50% stand. And then what does that leave room for? That not only puts disproportionate grazing pressure on the few crimson clover plants that are out there, but it also leaves a lot of vacant growing space for weeds to colonize. So a lot of times people will plant, 20 pounds of crimson clover seed thinking that's actually what you're supposed to plant. Yeah. They end up with a really sparse, weedy food plot and then wonder why. But it's because you didn't factor in pure live seed. It's such a simple thing to consider, but a lot of people don't take it into account, and then they end up with poor results.
Yeah, there's a lot more in that bag than seed.
Yes.
And all of the seed that is in that bag is not going to germinate. And they do testing on this to tell you how much of that bag is going to germinate. There's a lot of things. You mentioned the inert matter. So these clovers and stuff are going to come pre-inoculated. They have the beneficial bacteria and microbes that they need to grow and be successful. But to keep those things on the seed and alive, they put a clay coating around it. So a lot of that weight of the bag is the clay coating, the inert matter, like you said. So when you buy a 50-pound bag of seed, you're not getting a 50-pound bag of seed. You have to adjust, figure out that pure live seed, the PLS, and then adjust your planting rate to make sure that you are truly planting what you think you are. It is I agree with you 100%. It is right there with your soil sampling. It is that important. And I still think that we are still not reaching everybody with that. That's an important one, but we do. We have a lot of really cool resources that you can find on the MSU Deer Lab website, on the MSU Extension website, lots of stuff in there that y'all can look for on that. Let's switch gears to planting techniques. And I know we're running long. I know we could talk about this. Had from 8 to 5, we could have done this. Planting techniques. We've hit on this a little bit. I would speculate that most people like myself are planting with a disc, or not planting with a disc, preparing the food plot, the seed bed with the disc. The tiller we have now, I know, Luke, you do a lot with the no-till drill, and we can talk about that in another episode when we cover regenerative food plotting, that kind of thing. But what would you say is the most used equipment you have as far as the basics of getting a food plot built?
Yeah, you can do all of it with if I had to get 3 pieces of equipment to plant really high quality food plots, I would have a sprayer. If I'm just doing food plots, I'd have a tiller, and I would have a cyclone spreader. With just those 3 pieces of equipment, you can do a lot of stuff. And I would probably have a disc if I only could have one tillage implement, because I'm also using the disc for fire breaks. You don't want to run a tiller through the woods where you got a bunch of roots and get it all bound up. So
not if you want to use it again.
Yeah, exactly. Just with a sprayer, some kind of tillage implement, and a cyclone spreader, you can plant really high quality food plots.
Yeah. And Eric, you and I spent time this past summer, planting food plots with a hand spreader. It could be done. We fertilized and planted food plots with a hand spreader. So it's not the equipment that's going to limit you for the most part. Even if you're, no-till top sowing, you can do that. If you kill the existing vegetation, plant the right seeds, especially your smaller seeded, like your clovers and stuff, tend to do better than that. But I don't think there's a limitation as far as equipment goes when it comes to planting food plots. You could pick up a hand spreader for $15, $20, a backpack sprayer for not much more. So there's lots of ways to go about this. And if you've got the equipment, absolutely jump on the tractor. Makes life easier for a lot of different reasons. Or Luke, like I said, you plant a lot with the no-till drill. So lots of options out there. It won't be the equipment that limits you as far as getting your food plot planted.
Yeah.
I think so much of this comes back to managing your expectations too, right? Depending on what equipment you have and your objectives and what you want to do. It's all about just really being realistic with what you got.
Yeah, we're not, we didn't hand spread a 5-acre food plot or anything. It was some smaller research plots. That's a good point, Eric. We might not have went that route had it been 5 acres or so that we needed to plant.
Yeah. I certainly don't want to make it sound like everyone needs to go buy a no-till drill, because that is not the case, and they are very expensive. However, I prefer no other implement to a no-till drill. They are so stinking versatile. You can plant no-till, obviously, with them. You can plant, I use them very commonly to plant in conventional food plots that are tilled. And the reason I do that is because you can very precisely control seeding depth and very precisely control seeding rate. If you're using a cyclone spreader, if you calibrate your cyclone spreader, you can get pretty close, but it's hard to make sure your spacing is exact. So you're getting exactly 100 pounds per acre or whatever in the right area with the cyclone spreader. But if you're using a no-till drill, you can ensure, as long as it's calibrated, you can ensure that you are getting the right seed at the right rate to the right depth. And that is much more difficult to do with broadcast equipment. Now, certain species, it's not as important with broadcast equipment, but most species, it is. And, rule of thumb is seed to soil contact, like we talked about a minute ago, is important for all species, but it is easier to get decent seed to soil contact. Let me back up a minute. So if we're talking about, no-till top sowing, for example. So let's say we've got a food plot that's, we don't want to run a disc through, or we don't have a disc for whatever reason, and we want to plant a cool season food plot in there. You are generally going to have more success with small seeded species in no-till top sowing applications, because those small seeds, think about a pinball machine. Those small seeds are going to bounce their way down through all that thatch and find their way to the soil better than really large seeded species for. Cereal grains, they do okay. They do fairly well no-till top sowing, especially even if you're, broadcasting through thatch. But, your larger seeds, let's say, I know we're talking about cool season food plots, but let's say we're talking about corn or soybeans in a warm season food plot. You are not going to have great results no-till top sowing corn or soybeans through a thatch layer.
Yeah.
You'll get some to establish, and there are things you can do. Timing
And critters
of
are going to eat it.
Exactly.
That's another worry of mine, especially with cereal
Absolutely.
grains. I mean, the birds are going to move in and pick up everything that you just threw out.
Yep. So if you're no-till top sowing on a bare, let's say you use a burn down herbicide application and then you burn it with fire, and you've just got this, char, black, clean seed bed with very little debris on it, and then you go no-till top sow a cereal grain. Every crow and every turkey and every dove and every cotton rat and every bobwhite in the area is going to be in that food plot, and they're going to eat. If you don't get a rain within a day or two, most of your seeds are going to be gone.
Yeah.
Now, you can mitigate that some by leaving a good thatch layer to make it harder for those seed predators to get to those seeds. But, you got to be very careful of the timing of your planting, the size of the seeds you're planting, how preferred it is by different seed predators, how covered it is by thatch. One of the other reasons I love a no-till drill is because you can get that seed out of the reach of seed predators very easily with a no-till drill.
Well, I like the drills too because you can plant in the existing vegetation. It's just a really strategic way to run through there in rows and plant in the existing vegetation. I've always thought that was one of the most beneficial parts of a no-till drill too. And, so like you said, if you're going to do the no-till top sowing, again, we don't want equipment to be a limitation here, but there are some considerations. Your smaller seeded stuff, like you mentioned, your clovers, that kind of thing. And you may want to increase the rate by 25% or so, just to make sure, because some of that is not going to make it to the soil. You're not going to get the seed to soil contact, like Eric mentioned, was so important. So you may want to increase the rate just a little bit, but it can absolutely be done. And, another important consideration there, and I think we mentioned a little bit earlier, when you're planting something like your cereal grains, those large seeded plants, you're trying to get those under the dirt. Like you need those, you're looking for maybe an inch in depth there. When you're talking about those really tiny seeds like clover, if you've ever seen a clover seed, they're tiny. You don't want them to get any deeper than, say, a quarter inch or something like that, So I often, even with our, hand spreaders, I don't mix them together, because the larger seeded and the smaller seeds are going to fall to the bottom or the top or whatever it may be. I tend to like to spread them separately myself, just so I know that I got a good application of wheat or oats, and then I came back and got a good application of whatever clovers that I'm planting.
Yep. This is extra work, but I will often do what you just described, and I will take, let's say I'm planting into a conventional tillage seed bed, and I've got a nice seed bed prepared. I will often go through and I'll put my cereal grain in the drill, and I will drill that 3/4 of an inch to an inch deep. And then once that's planted, I will go back, vacuum out all the wheat in that drill, put clover in, and I will unhook. This is really important. Unhook the drop tubes on your drill. So essentially that drill is dropping the clover uniformly across the coverage area by the drill. It's not planting in rows. It's broadcasting it across that whole 6 foot or 10 foot or however big your drill is. In doing so, not only are you putting wheat and clover, each of them at the depth they're supposed to be, wheat's going deeper, clover's going shallower, but by broadcasting the clovers, we're using the drill, but we're essentially broadcasting it. By broadcasting the clovers, we are getting more uniform coverage of the food plot, and the more uniform your coverage, the more your planted species are going to be consuming growing space that weeds would otherwise colonize.
Yeah.
So if you plant your wheat in the same row as your clover, most drills, you got 7.5 inch, maybe 15 inch, whatever, 30 inch row spacing. You've got a row of wheat and clover, and then you've got 7.5 inches minimum of vacant growing space. Something is going to colonize that growing space. And if you don't make it one of your planted species, it's probably going to be a weed. That's why I like to put my clovers everywhere and just my wheat in rows.
I really like that. That's cool. I like that. You're right. And that's the open space. You got to have the right context here, but open space is the worst thing, or the best thing for weeds, I guess you should say.
Yeah.
Because there is something in the dirt, there's something in the soil that's going to grow if you leave open space. And it's likely not what you want it to be. And it's likely something that's going to come in strong, reproduce quickly, and start overtaking the thing. So on to the weeds. Let's talk weed management. One thing I'll preface before we get going in this, and I feel like this is getting more common though, but just because it grows and you didn't plant it doesn't mean it's a weed that you don't want. For example, we've got plots right now I'm seeing a lot of ragweed in. That's good stuff. It's not in too dense. It's not overtaking anything. It's complementing what we already have. It's adding one more option that we didn't pay for, that deer have naturally evolved to eat. So just kind of prefacing the whole weed, it's all within context what a weed means. So anyways, Luke, what's your thoughts on herbicides, or just run with that?
Yeah, this could be an entire 4 podcast series in and of itself. It's a very complex topic that varies so much there's so many different things to talk about here. But I will back up and start at the very beginning with what you just mentioned right there. And I will say that from my perspective, a weed is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
There are some food plot managers that are okay with a lot of unplanted species in their food plots, and those are not weeds. Weeds are unwanted species. And that's my definition of a weed. It's anything that you do not want. If you do not mind having ragweed and some daisy fleabane and some pokeweed and some, other things growing up in your food plot, then it's not a weed. And in many cases, those species, even pigweed. I mean, pigweed is one of the nastiest agricultural weeds on the planet. But go look at a field where you got some pigweeds growing, especially smooth pigweed or green pigweed, and the deer, I almost guarantee you, are eating them. Yeah. Deer will eat some pigweed now.
Yeah.
So weeds, let me just say unplanted species can certainly add to the value of a food plot, not only for forage production, but also for structure. If you think of a perennial clover food plot in May, let's take a Durana clover food plot in May. Okay. That Durana might be a couple inches tall. And without weeds, it would just be this sea of 3-inch or 4-inch tall Durana clover. If you allow common ragweed to colonize that food plot, all of a sudden you've added an immense value of structural complexity for something like a turkey brood.
Yeah.
Right now, and you don't want any weed overtaking your food plot. I don't want a sea of common ragweed in my Durana food plots, but I do not mind 15-20% coverage of ragweed or daisy fleabane or even horseweed in a lot of my food plots, because it adds great value to the structural complexity of that food plot, which greatly influences which critters are going to use it and how much time they want to spend there. A turkey hen probably doesn't want to have her brood that's 10 or 14 days old out in a food plot where they are completely exposed to overhead predators. I mean, overhead predators are the number one whacker of young broods. And having some structural complexity of plants like horseweed or daisy fleabane or ragweed that's kind of protecting those turkey poults, allowing them to get underneath and hide and bug and eat on clover, and while still allowing the hen to get her head up and periscope over the top of everything, can be very valuable in a food plot. And same thing for deer. I mean, a lot of these weeds are, like you mentioned a minute ago, deer eat hundreds of plant species. And having a food plot that's got, various unplanted species growing up sporadically throughout it can really add to the diversity and the attractiveness of a food plot. That being said, you do not want a food plot overrun by weeds, because all that does is essentially cause you to waste money. If you plant into a food plot and let it be overtaken by weeds, those weeds are going to be out competing the species that you plant. I would argue, if you're just like, I don't want to use herbicide and I'm not going to mow and I'm not going to control weeds in any way, and I'm just going to let it be what it'll be and let nature take its course, then don't plant a food plot. Manage an old field.
Yeah.
Right? Don't be spending money on expensive seed and soil amendments just to let those seeds be overtaken by weeds. There has got to be some threshold for weed acceptance by any food plotter. Otherwise, you're just wasting money on seed. So that's my, tangent there on, a weed is in the eye of the beholder. So
I agree with you. And on the other side of that, I think a lot of people, they plant a food plot and they're like, oh, if it doesn't look pristine and it's only the species that I planted. Well, whether you're talking food plots or habitat management, whatever, a lot of what we consider to be aesthetically pleasing, like that, that looks pretty well managed, manicured. That's not wildlife habitat. And I hate to use the term wildlife habitat. Pick a critter. That's what it's habitat or critter specific, right? But a lot of times, if it's good deer habitat, it's not something you want to go walk around in, and it may not, unless you know what you're looking at. It's not going to be pretty, I guess, and that's okay. That's good stuff for a lot of reasons. So Luke, you did, great job on explaining that. I like it when that stuff comes in, but I also don't want to be, wasting money. So, there is a threshold at which, okay, well, I need to intervene. This is getting a little too thick in here, a little too heavy.
Fine line between having diversity and throwing money out the window, right?
100%. But I like what Luke said too about, okay, well, if this is not what you're wanting to do, then do the old field management.
Yes.
Go that route then. Lots of options here. And in my opinion, I'm a big fan of food plots, but the old field management, I really enjoy that. I really like that habitat management side of it. And in my opinion, you could call that a natural food plot. Seeds are there, food's there, get the crap out of the way, promote what's there that deer have evolved to eat for hundreds, thousands of years, whatever.
Yep.
I agree.
So look, weed management. What tools do you keep with you? What are you ready to go with at any time? It's got to be a few staples, right?
Well, I think the most foundational principle of weed management is proper seeding rates and seed placement in the soil. You want your planting to be suppressing weeds on its own. And if you do it the right way, and a big part of this is controlling deer density. If you have your deer density under control and those deer are not overwhelming your planting should, in the vast majority of cases, make its own gravy in terms of weed management. You should not need to be spraying herbicides on food plots. In most cases, if your food plots are large enough and or you're keeping your deer density under control. We were just talking about vacant growing space a minute ago on what that means for weeds. Yeah. If you plant a 1 acre food plot of anything, American joint vetch is one of the most grazing tolerant. I know we're talking about cool season species. Let's go with wheat, almost wheat or whatever. Very grazing tolerant, even right after it germinates. Deer can nip it off very low to the ground and it'll keep growing. But if you plant even 100, 200 pounds per acre of wheat in a food plot, and it's a half acre or 1 acre plot on a very high deer density property, I almost guarantee you by the time January or February rolls around, you're going to have a bunch of weeds in there because there's been open dirt all fall and winter that weeds have colonized. Alternatively, if you plant a larger food plot and or keep your deer density in line with the amount of food on the landscape, that planting is going to jump up out of the ground and form a canopy that suppresses weeds on its own. I could show picture after picture after picture of food plots where I've got an exclusion cage set up, and inside the exclusion cage, there might be 4 or 6 inches or a foot of growth inside that exclusion cage, and you cannot find a single weed in there. Yeah. But go outside the exclusion cage 3 inches away, and it's covered up in weeds. It's because inside that exclusion cage, that planting was forming a canopy and intercepting the sunlight before it got to the ground. And it was, competing for soil nutrients and water too. But a big factor of it is sunlight. If sunlight is getting to the ground, you are going to have more weeds. So, I would say the absolute most important tool in weed management is a cultural technique. And that's making sure your seeds are spaced properly, they're planted at the right depth, and your deer density is in check with the amount of food that's available in the landscape. Herbicides and other weed management practices are absolutely secondary to that one right there.
I think that's a great point. I love that you bring up the biology back into it, right? If there's not enough food to go around and you have a really high deer density, you're not managing deer numbers, it doesn't really matter what you do. You're going to have an issue, whether that's with your natural habitat or the food plot. Yeah. It's a really good point to bring up.
Well, and it's just the right way to do it. There's reasons for it. There's reasons for planting rates, and there's reasons that you do certain things. And I think the weed management perspective is not one we think about a lot. We immediately go to, what do we spray on it? You know what I mean? What do we mow? What do we spray? That kind of thing. I think the first 30 seconds, Luke, of you talking about that is our soundbite. Like, I think you just gave us our soundbite. That was perfect. I think it is often overlooked in such an important concept. And it goes back to, I think people think about forest stand improvement and they think about the sunlight and that kind of thing. Shrink yourself down to being 6 inches tall, 3 or 6 inches tall. It's the same idea, right? If there is open space, if there is sunlight getting to the ground, something's going to grow. If there's not already something there consuming resources and keeping weeds, knocked back. So I think that's perfect. So once you've done all that and you tend to have an issue, what do you think in herbicide wise?
So for cool season food plots in the deep south, in my experience, our most problematic weeds are going to be ryegrass, and that's probably going to be our most problematic grass. We got bromes and some other things, but ryegrass is probably the most problematic, and buttercups tend to be really problematic, chickweed, henbit, things like that. Every one of those species that I just listed, you can control with herbicides as long as you are very careful about the species that you plant in that food plot.
Yeah.
If you go in there and you just willy-nilly plant a blend of 10 different species and it's got brassicas and it's got clovers and it's got cereal grains and it's got X, Y, and Z, you have essentially taken your herbicide toolbox down to zero in terms of what you can spray and kill weeds while not killing your planted species.
Yeah.
So
we go to those selective herbicides. That's what we're getting at, right? So if you plant a huge mix of all different kinds of plants, it's hard to be selective. You know, it's hard to pick that one herbicide that's going to help. And you often see, I would say warm season obviously is a much tougher time for weed management. Cool season, the one that I've always had to battle was ryegrass. And we're not talking about cereal rye, we're talking about just your typical ryegrass that grows easy in the bed of your truck. It's beautiful, it's green, it's lush. There are many more options that are more nutritionally efficient for whitetail deer that they eat more often, and that is not such an invasive plant. I've really gotten myself in trouble with ryegrass and had to battle that for many, many years. But yeah, back to the herbicide thing.
So I guess to kind of start the herbicide conversation, we should classify the couple main categories of herbicide. We've got broad spectrum herbicides, broad spectrum non-selective. So think of glyphosate, think of Liberty or glufosinate. Broad spectrum non-selective herbicides are going to, with very few exceptions, kill everything that you spray them on. So think of a burn down application prior to planting your cool season food plot. Then you've got broad spectrum selective herbicides. Broad spectrum selective herbicides control some forbs, some grasses, and some sedges, but not every species of forb, grass, and sedge. And then we've got selective herbicides. So selective herbicides will only control one of the plant groups. When I say plant group, I mean forb, grass, sedge. Those are the three main ones that we're thinking of in the context of a food plot. So to kind of recap that, we've got our broad spectrum non-selective glyphosate, going to kill everything you sprayed on. We've got our broad spectrum selective, think Pursuit or imazethapyr. It's going to control some species of grass, some species of forb, some species of sedge, but not every species of grass, forb, and sedge. So you can obviously kind of use those herbicides to very strategically spray over the top of plantings that fall within one of those categories that aren't controlled. And then we've got things like clethodim or 2,4-D. Clethodim is a grass selective herbicide, so we'll only control grasses. And 2,4-D is a broadleaf selective herbicide that there are a few exceptions with like 2,4-D or dicamba. They are broadleaf selective herbicides, but they can ding up some grass crops if you spray them at the wrong stage. For example, you're not supposed to spray oats at certain stages of maturity with 2,4-D or you can ding them up. But in general, 2,4-D is a good example of a broadleaf selective herbicide. If you spray it on brassicas, if you spray it on clover, especially at a high rate, it's going to kill every brassica and every clover in that food plot. So when we're thinking about developing seed mixes for our cool season food plots, it is extremely beneficial. And I would argue that it's paramount to having a successful food plot for you to be aware of which cool season weeds are likely to be problematic in your area. Go look in a fallow field that was fallow the previous year. Look at what weeds are there. Talk to a neighbor, talk to your local state agency biologist, somebody that can tell you what the most problematic weeds are going to be in your area, and then select a food plot planting, whether it's a monoculture planting or a blend, that will allow you to control the weeds that are likely to be problematic. So ryegrass is a classic example. Okay. Let's say we know we're going to have a ryegrass problem in our food plot. We're not going to want to plant a monoculture of oats. Okay. If you plant a monoculture of oats in the fall, by the time you get to January, you're going to have 50% or more of your stand is going to be ryegrass. By the time you get to March or April, probably 100% of your stand is going to be ryegrass because it is going to outcompete everything, especially if you got a clover in there too. It'll outcompete your clovers. If I got a ryegrass problem, I'm going to do one of two things. I'm either going to plant exclusively clovers to allow me to use herbicides like clethodim, which will control ryegrass. It's grass selective, but it won't control your clovers. Or one of my favorite options is to plant just wheat and clovers. Don't include cereal rye and don't include oats, but plant wheat and clovers. And that allows you to use, there's a couple herbicides, but the active ingredient is panoxidin. And Axial or Axial Bold is the trade name. And Axial is labeled for ryegrass control in wheat. So you can actually spray panoxidin over top of your wheat and control the ryegrass while not harming your wheat. So I really like that option if you know that ryegrass is going to be a problem.
I think you'd tip, and I would plant clovers and then I would spray. And the key is to spray and kill that ryegrass before it goes to seed. And if you do that year after year after year, the idea is that you're going to deplete the seed bank of the ryegrass that is existing, right? So you're trying not to put yourself in a position where you don't have an herbicide. But we are seeing different herbicides that allow you to do like you just mentioned with Axial. And then another one that comes to mind that is a little more specific is like Butirac 2,4-DB, that you can actually spray that in your clovers, and it tends to kill other broadleaf species as well. So there are some of the more specific type of herbicides that you can research and figure out clever ways to get rid of some of the weeds.
Yeah. Butirac is a really good example. If I'm planting a cool season clover plot, and I think that I'm going to have a problem with broadleaf weeds that fall, winter, spring, I'm gonna stick with clovers, and that will allow me to use Butirac and or Pursuit, which is a broad spectrum selective herbicide. Pursuit will control many species of grass. It'll control ryegrass too if it's young, and it'll control various species of broadleaves. And Butirac is another good option, and Basagran. Basagran is another really good option to spray in your clover food plots that will control many species of broadleaf plants. And Basagran is also really good with sedges. If you've got a bad sedge problem in your cool season food plot and you've got clovers planted in there, you can use Basagran, you can use Pursuit, you can use Butirac. And whether I use any of those three, it's going to depend on which weed species I have. So get a plant ID app or just figure out which weed you've got and then reference the herbicide label, and it'll tell you which weed species that herbicide is stronger on or weaker on, and then kind of tailor your herbicide program based on which weeds you've got.
Yeah, for sure. That's where the plant identification comes in. It is important. And another thing that I've gotten myself in trouble with is you have to spray those weeds at a certain height. If you let them grow too tall, too big, whatever you want to call it, if you let them get too old, it's really tough to control them with some of the herbicides. I've really had issues, especially warm season food plots, letting Morning Glory or something get a little too tall and too resilient. So something else to consider. There are options out there. Lots of, again, we've got publications and stuff that'll steer you in the right direction. Luke, we're working on an herbicide publication right now that should come out and should be super impactful. Yeah, I don't know when that'll come out, but in the near future.
Yeah, sometime in the near future. That's a very good point. The stage of weed growth is critical to herbicide efficacy. Most herbicide labels will list, let's say, common ragweed, just as an example. It'll say, if your common ragweed is less than 4 inches tall, spray at this rate. If it's 4 to 6 inches tall, spray at this rate. If it's greater than 6 inches tall, tough crap. You're not gonna kill it. These weeds get so much more difficult to control the older they get because they're older. Their root system is larger. They're just not going to absorb enough herbicide to translocate into their entire root system to kill that plant. You might burn it back, but they get very difficult to control when they get older. So not only is timing of herbicide application important for weed control in terms of killing that weed, but let's think about let's say I got a crimson clover and red clover food plot that I plant in the fall, and I want it to be productive all throughout the following spring and into the next summer. I might have a a weed problem that really starts to kind of show up around January with maybe henbit dead nettle or purple dead nettle or chickweed. Okay. Those 3 weeds, often they start really short and they're really hard to notice at first unless you get down and you kind of peer in the clover plants and you're like, oh, there's some little weeds, but they don't look problematic. I'm not going to fool with them. I would say the most common mistake I see with people and herbicide applications is they'll post on a Facebook group and be like, hey, what do I spray on this food plot? I got this weed, and they've got buttercup that's 24 inches tall. It's like, I mean, you are 3 months too late to the party. That should have been sprayed when it was 2.4 inches tall, not 24 inches tall. So for a couple of reasons, not only is it herbicide more effective, but if you think about when these weeds start to germinate, let's say in the deep south, it's going to be January, maybe February. If you get into the mid south, it's going to be February or March. Those weeds start really small and they are very inconspicuous and they don't seem problematic. But if you wait until they're equal height or taller than your planted species, you might still be able to control them, but they have now competed with those planted species heading into spring green up. And this is hugely important. I can't overstate this enough. By controlling your weeds early in the winter or early in their life cycle, you are eliminating the competition for your planted species and allowing your planted species, your red clover and your crimson clover in the example I'm using, to fill in that vacant growing space and head into spring green up at a better starting point than they would if you waited for a month to control that competition. If you control those weeds in January and your crimson clover and red clover, they're going to be kind of growing slowly in January and February because it's really cold and not a lot of, growing, not great growing conditions, but they will slowly fill in that vacant growing space and they will head into spring green up with a carpet and they'll have a good root system and there'll be excellent coverage. So they head into spring green up sitting on G and waiting on O. They are ready to take off as soon as the weather is cooperative. Alternatively, if you let these weeds take over 25-50% of your food plot before you spray them, and you don't spray until right at the start of spring green up, then you've got all these dead spots with vacant soil just waiting for something to colonize. And the crimson clover and the red clover, they'll fill in that growing space a little bit, but in spring green up, other stuff is starting to germinate. So now you're going to head into springtime and early summer with another flush of weeds. Yeah. So you're kind of, shooting yourself in the foot by waiting until the weeds are a problem to spray them. You need to spray them before they become a problem.
Yeah, and there's resources out there. So, there's tons and tons of resources. We have a lot of them too to explain the herbicides, the ins and outs of this. So if you see that you have an issue or even think you're going to have an issue, be prepared, because there is a window of time in which you can take action. And then past that, there ain't much you can do. And I've personally gotten myself in a lot of trouble with that in the past and just wasted herbicide and didn't have a food plot that could have been much better, I should say. Yeah, that's good stuff. And if you got any questions, reach out to us on social media, send us an email, whatever it may be, give us a call. All of our contact information's online. We do monitor the socials and stuff. Luke does a fantastic job with all that. So, if y'all got questions, reach out to us. I'm sure there's much more that we could have talked about. This could have been an all-day thing. So with that, y'all guys, you got anything else? Think we got it?
I think we covered it all.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good start to at least getting food plots on your mind. It's like I said, 'tis the season. So we appreciate y'all tuning in. I thank y'all. Y'all have a good one.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson family for their endowed financial support. We would not be able to do this without it. We're also grateful to our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service, and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center.
If you have questions or ideas, check out MSUDeerLab.com and hit the Deer University tab. Thanks for listening.